Somewhere in the last few years, your fingernails quietly developed a set of fine vertical lines that were not there in your youth. They run the whole length of the nail from the cuticle out to the tip, and they catch the light when you turn your hand a certain way. They were smooth once when you never thought about your hands at all, and somewhere in the years since, the lines arrived and slowly deepened. Almost everyone past a certain age carries them. Almost everyone has filed them quietly under the ordinary wear of getting older, the same drawer where the reading glasses and the stiff morning knees go. Yet those lines were written underneath the nail you see months before they ever surfaced inside a strip of living tissue you have gone your whole life without looking at. The pattern on the surface is a transcript of what that hidden tissue lived through during the months it took for that piece of nail to grow out to the tip. The only question worth asking is what the transcript says. Most people meet the ridges by accident, a snag on a wool sweater that was not there a few years ago, the way a buff nail no longer comes up to a clean shine because the surface has gone faintly corrugated, the catch of a fingertip against a page. You notice, you shrug, you assume the nail itself has simply worn, the way a stair tread wears, and you move on. The reading you skipped is the interesting one, and it starts nowhere near the surface that caught the wool. To read it, you have to look at the place the nail actually comes from, and that place is not on the finger you can see. Consider that the visible nail is dead. Every cell in it stopped being alive long before it reached the part you can tap against a table. All of it was made in a small crescent of living, dividing tissue tucked behind the cuticle called the matrix, and that crescent is where the whole story gets written, out of sight beneath the fold of skin at the base of the nail. What sits at your fingertip is the finished output. The factory itself is hidden, a centimeter back, under the skin, working every hour of every day, whether you attend to it or not. The matrix does one thing, relentlessly. Its cells divide, they flatten, they fill themselves with a hard structural protein called keratin. They die, and the next cells dividing behind them shove the dead ones forward. What you call your fingernail is the swept-out exhaust of that process, pushed steadily out from under the cuticle at roughly the width of a few hairs each week. Growth is patient. It slows a little with the years, and it slows differently from one person to the next, which is part of why no two sets of hands age at quite the same pace. Do the arithmetic on that crawl, and something surprising falls out. The tissue at your fingertip today was manufactured back near the cuticle, something like 4 to 6 months ago. You are looking, quite literally, at last season's output, carried out to the end of the finger and held up to the light. That relentless pace runs on a small reserve of dividing cells that has to keep replacing itself. Every keratin-filled scale pushed out toward the tip had to be born from a division, and every division draws down a pool of dividing cells the matrix must continually top up from behind. That pool is not bottomless. Its cells carry the ordinary wear of a lifetime of dividing, and each division asks for a burst of energy, a clean copy of the blueprint, and a full delivery of raw material, all of it arriving on time. Slow any one of those and the pace of the whole strip eases. The matrix runs, in other words, right at the edge of its supply, which is exactly why it is so quick to register the smallest shortfall in what the blood brings it. The interesting physics of the body tends to live at these margins, where a tissue runs close to its limit and the tiniest change in supply shows up on the outside. The matrix lives right at that margin. The tissue running at its limit records every shortfall. Now for the part almost nobody is ever told. The matrix is divided lengthwise into narrow strips, rather than working as one smooth sheet producing a uniform slab. Each strip runs like its own independent production line, laying down its own thin ribbon of nails side by side with its neighbors. Picture a long row of parallel lines in a workshop, each one turning out the same product, each one running at whatever speed its own supply of parts allows. When every strip works at the same steady pace, the ribbons emerge level, they fuse seamlessly at their edges, and the surface you see is smooth as glass. When one strip slows while the strip beside it keeps pace, the two ribbons stop matching in height. The taller ribbon and the shorter one meet along a seam, and that seam rides forward with the growing nail as a faint standing groove. That groove is the ridge. Each vertical ridge on your nail marks a boundary where one column fell behind the one running next to it. So a ridge is the record of a line that's slowed, which lands you on the obvious next question. What decides which lines slow and which keep going strong? It comes down to the plumbing. Every one of those production lines is fed by blood, and the vessels doing the feeding are among the very tiniest in your entire body, threaded through the fold of skin sitting just above the matrix. Each strip of dividing tissue leans on the little vessel nearest to it for everything it needs to keep building nail: oxygen to burn, sugar for fuel, the amino acid bricks that keratin is assembled from, the trace metals the cellular machinery runs on. The line, you see, is only ever as fast as the vessel standing behind it, and when that vessel falters, the line has nowhere else to turn for parts. Look closer at how that blood actually arrives, because the shape of the plumbing is half the story. The supply arrives as a dense row of tiny hairpin loops, each vessel climbing up toward the tissue, turning at the top, and diving back down, packed side by side like a comb of fine wire rather than as one broad river. De Burger described the matrix and its supply in this looped column-by-column arrangement, each loop serving the strip of dividing cells directly above it, and very little else. That geometry is the whole system reads out the way it does. Because the loops sit apart from one another, a single loop can fail while the loop beside it stays whole, and when one fails, there is no wide shared river to cover for it. The strip above a failed loop simply goes hungry while its neighbor eats. Independent supply lines make independent failures, and independent failures are what a ridged nail is a picture of. Here is where the nail quietly stops being a story about nails. Those microscopic loops age in exactly the way the great vessels do, through exactly the same physics, only where you cannot watch it happen. The smooth inner lining of any vessel, the endothelium, slowly loses its capacity to make nitric oxide, the small molecule that signals the vessel wall to relax and stay open. As that capacity fades, the vessel sits tighter and stiffer than it did in youth, holding a little more resistance against every heartbeat. The identical loss, of course, unfolds in these hair-fine vessels above the matrix. Their lining dims in the same way, and they clench a fraction tighter, and less blood arrives at the strips of tissue depending on them. There is a second, slower insult stacked on top of the first, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is the same chemistry that turns up in nearly aging tissue this channel has ever examined. Sugar molecules drifting in the blood collide with the long-lived proteins in a vessel wall and, now and then, latch on permanently. Once latched, they begin cross-linking those proteins to one another, welding neighboring strands together into a stiff, glassy, tangled lattice. It is a slow caramelizing of living tissue, and the body carries no tool to reverse it once it has set. This is the very same cross-linking that clouds and hardens the lens inside the eye until it can no longer focus up close, and the very same welding that stiffens the broad wall of the aorta over a lifetime. In a vessel already losing its nitric oxide, this glassy lattice is the second turn of the screw. The wall grows rigid. The channel through it narrows. Some of these tiny loops in time close off completely and are gone. And here the two insults compound into a third effect that finishes the picture. A young hand keeps its full comb of loops packed tight, so that if one falters, a neighbor sits close enough to share a little overflow at the edges. As the decades pass, the body prunes back the whole density of this microscopic supply. The comb thins, loops are lost and not replaced, and the survivors sit farther apart than they did, each one now solely responsible for its strip, with no neighbor to lean on. So the same failure that a young matrix could paper over becomes, in an older one, a strip left fully stranded. The thinning of the comb is quiet, gradual, invisible from outside, and it is precisely what tips a matrix from smooth output into the ridged, uneven output you can finally see. What began as chemistry in a vessel wall ends as a groove. You can feel with the thumbnail. You already know the circulation by feel, even if you have never named it. The hands that go cold and stay cold long after the rest of you has warmed. The small cut on a fingertip that takes its slow time to close, where the same nick on a forearm would have sealed in a day. The blanch of a fingertip pressed white against a table, and the extra beat it now takes to flush pink again when you lift it. All of that is the same microscopic supply, the same comb of loops, reporting the same slow decline in a different register. The fingertips sit at the far end of the line, farthest from the heart, first to feel any tightening of the small vessels and last to be rescued. The matrix is buried in that same borderland of the circulation, and it is writing down what the cold hands and the slow healing cuts are only hinting at. Follow the consequence down to a single strip. A production line whose feeding loop has narrowed, stiffened, or vanished runs short of oxygen, short of fuel, short of bricks. It cannot help but slow, and the column immediately beside it, fed by a vessel that happened to stay in good repair, carries on at close to full speed. The mismatch between two neighbors who once ran in perfect step is exactly what rises to the surface, months later, as a ridge you can catch with a fingertip in the light. A deeper ridge means a wider gap in supply between two neighboring strips. A nail crowded with ridges means many columns running short at once, and the slow arrival of all of it across your 40s and 50s, faint at first and then unmistakable, is simply the tiny plumbing falling quietly behind in one strip after another, year on year, until the surface can no longer keep the secret. An honest limit belongs here, stated plainly, rather than buried. That each single ridge pairs to one specific failing loop is the most reasonable reading of the anatomy, and it lines up well with what clinicians see when they photograph the living vessels at the base of the nail. The correspondence between where the loops run and where the ridges fall is close, as Nakamura and colleagues characterized in imaging the nail fold circulation directly. What has not been shown, vessel by vessel under a lens, is the exact one-for-one pairing of this ridge to that failed loop. The direction of the whole thing is solid. The perfect one-to-one is still an inference drawn from the anatomy, and you deserve to know which part is which. Those loops decide which lines go short. But short of what exactly? What is riding in that blood that a dividing cell simply cannot build nail without? 3 quiet passengers, each at a different bench. Begin with iron. Before a matrix cell can divide, it first has to copy its entire strand of genetic instructions, the long coiled molecule usually shortened to DNA, the master blueprint every cell keeps folded in its core. Copying that blueprint means building fresh raw material for the new strand, one particular building block at a time, and there is a single cellular machine responsible for making that block. Every new strand of blueprint in the body has to pass through this one machine, which makes it a genuine bottleneck, the narrowest point in the whole assembly. And that machine carries an iron atom sitting right at its working heart, an atom it uses to grab and pass along a piece of the reaction it could not perform without it. That iron is the catch that lets the machine turn over at all. Starve it of iron and the bottleneck tightens further. The copying slows, the cell divides less often, and the line it belongs to lays down its ribbon of nail more slowly than its neighbors. Because every division in that strip has to squeeze through this one iron-dependent gate, a drop in iron delivery from a narrowed loop is the first thing in the entire chain to bite, and it bites hard. Now turn to zinc. Zinc plays a different role at a different bench. There is a family of protein switches inside the cell whose whole job is to reach out and grip the blueprint at exactly the right spot so the cell reads the right genes at the right moment while it is busy building nail. Those switches only hold their gripping shape because a zinc atom is clamped into the fold of each one, pinching the protein into the precise hooked form it needs to catch the strand. Without the zinc atom pinning it, the switch goes limp and can no longer find its spot on the blueprint. Naturally, hundreds of other cellular tools borrow zinc for the same structural trick, so the metal is stretched thin across a great deal of work at once. Let zinc run short and the cell still manages to make nail, but the switches slip. The reading goes subtly wrong and the keratin comes off the line with its internal structure, a shade misbuilt. The nail turns brittle and the ridges sharpened because the grade of the material itself has fallen alongside the speed of the line. Iron governs how fast the nail is built. Zinc governs how well. Then biotin, the third passenger working at the third bench. Biotin clips onto a small set of assembly enzymes and acts as their carrier arm, the part that ferries a needed fragment into place so the enzyme can lengthen a fatty molecule chain. Those fatty chains matter here because the nail packs the narrow gaps between its hardened cells with a soft, waxy, lipid-rich cement rather than stacking them dry like bricks without mortar. That cement is what welds thousands of separate dead cells into one continuous water-resisting plate that bends as a single sheet. Pull biotin out of the supply and the carrier arm goes missing, the fatty chains come up short, and the cement between the cells thins and weakens. The cells no longer bind tightly to one another. The plate loses its internal grip, so it grows fragile, It splits and peels at the free edge, and the ridges stand out more plainly, because a plate that is no longer glued into one block flexes unevenly over every strip beneath it. Iron sets the pace of building. Zinc sets the grade of the material. Biotin sets the strength of the glue that holds the finished cells as one. Each passenger boards at its own step, and each shortage leaves its own distinct signature written into the plate. That distinction is the entire diagnostic worth of the surface, and it is where a careful eye earns its keep. When the whole body runs genuinely short of iron, every line slows more or less together, in step, and the nail thins evenly right across its width, with very little ridging at all, a uniform fading rather than a set of grooves. Age writes something altogether different. Age picks off individual lines one at a time, as this vessel fails and then that one, months apart, which is why the older nail comes up ridged and uneven rather than smoothly thin, some grooves shallow, some deep, a whole rippled landscape instead of a gentle even slope. Cashman and Sloan mapped precisely these correspondences between what the nail plate shows and what is happening in the body underneath. The surface reading the interior. For most people well past 50, the vertical ridges are the second story, the plumbing story, far more than any simple shortage of a nutrient in the diet. The metals explain what a dividing cell needs to have delivered. The plumbing explains why the delivery started arriving unevenly. There is more information sitting in the ridges than most people ever suspect, once you know the two things to read. The depth of a groove tells you the size of the gap in supply between the two strips on either side of it, because a strip badly starved falls far behind its healthy neighbor, and the seam between them stands tall, while a strip only slightly short leaves a shallow scratch you can barely feel. So a deep ridge is a big local failure, and a faint one is a small one, written to scale. The spacing tells you something else again. A nail scattered with just a few widely separated ridges is one where only a handful of loops have failed, here and there across the comb. A nail closely packed with ridge after ridge, wall to wall, is a comb, thin so far that failed strips sit next to failed strips with barely a healthy one between. Depth reads the severity. Spacing reads the extent. Together they turn a set of lines you might have dismissed as texture into something closer to a chart. Each metal at its own bench, each shortage with its own fingerprint on the plate. So what happens when you stop reading a single ridge and read the whole nail at once, end to end, as one continuous surface? It turns into a calendar. This stretch of nail from cuticle to tip is roughly half a year of manufacturing, laid down strictly in order, oldest at the free end and newest down at the base. That strict ordering, mind you, is the thing that makes the nail readable at all, because it means position along the nail is really position in time. A single week of serious illness, when the whole body inflames and blood pulls inward, away from the fingertips, can slow every production line at once, all together, and it stamps a single deep valley straight across the nail, cutting through every line at the same moment. Doctors have a name for that transverse trench, Bow's line, after the physician who first described it, and having formed, it rides slowly outward over the following months as the nail grows beneath it, a dated marker of a bad week, traveling toward the tip. A long stretch of poor nutrition prints instead, as a whole broad zone of thinner, weaker nail. And vertical ridges, deepening gradually year over year, are the signature of the slow plumbing decline, written the long way down the nail, running with the direction of growth, precisely because it never once stopped to draw a line across. Consider, then, what all of this makes the nail. Your hair grows out and gets cut away, its record snipped off and swept from the floor. Your skin renews and sheds its whole surface every few weeks, wiping the slate clean before anything can accumulate. The nail alone keeps its history intact and legible, pushing the old ones forward toward the tip instead of discarding them, each thin strip of width standing in for about a week of the life you were living while it formed. It is the one tissue that files its reports and never shreds them. When you tilt your hand to the light and study the ridges, you are reading a report the Matrix filed a season ago and simply never took back. My own hand stopped being about grooming the day this became clear to me. I catch myself now at the sink, reading them like a page. The nail keeps the record, faithfully, month after month. Which leaves one final question standing. What, in the end, actually wrote it? The same physics that has been quietly riding on every other part of you, in every place you were never able to watch. Bring the separate threads together and they all run back to a single source. The microscopic vessels above the matrix lose their nitric oxide and clench a little tighter. The exact endothelial slide that plays out in the small vessels that open and flush when you move your body. Their walls stiffen under that glassy sugar and protein cross-linking, the same slow caramelizing that clouds the lens and hardens the aorta. The dividing stem cells of the matrix themselves tire across the decades and divide less freely, worn down by the same fraying of the cell's internal quality control and the same steady decline in the molecule that ferries usable energy inside every one of them. Vessel, cement, and cell. 3 failures, sliding down together. All of the mechanisms this channel has traced, one at a time through organs you will never once lay eyes on across your whole life. An honest boundary belongs here too, the same care as before. That these broad categories of aging act on the matrix at all is well grounded and not in serious doubt. Whether they act at precisely the same pace here as they do in the aorta or the lens of the eye is far less settled, and honestly nobody should claim it yet. The direction holds firmly. The exact rate is left open. The nail is simply the one accessible place where the direction of all of it finally breaks the surface. That is what makes this small strip of tissue so rare and so worth understanding. The artery stiffened where you had no way to watch it. The energy inside your cells declined where you had no way to watch it. The vessel lining lost its capacity to relax where you had no way to watch it. The matrix went through the very same physics as all of them, and then did the one thing none of the others could manage. It wrote its result out in plain lines on a surface you glance at, without thinking, every single day of your life. Hold your hand up to the light now and turn it until the ridges catch a shadow. They run from the cuticle to the tip. Each one is the boundary between a matrix column still producing at its original rate and a column that slowed. The column slowed because the capillary feeding it narrowed through the same failing of the vessel lining and the same sugar and protein cross-linking that stiffens the large arteries. The iron that should have loaded the enzyme at the center of blueprint copying arrived in lower concentration through narrower vessels. The stem cells divided slower. The keratin output dropped in that one column while the column beside it carried on. The difference rose to the surface as a line you can see and touch. The ridges were cosmetic only for as long as nobody could read them. They are a production report written by the matrix on the only surface your body offers as a readable record, and the report says exactly what your vessels, your nutrients, and your stem cells have been doing for the last 6 months. You look at the ridges and you see aging. You are right. The ridges are the transcript.